Podcast. We love an audio stimmer, harmony and self-acceptance. It's the AuDHD Psych Podcast.
Hello friends, welcome back to the AuDHD Psych Podcast. I'm Aaron Howearth, clinical psychologist, and we are different, not defective. Why are more biological males or men diagnosed autism ADHD than biological females? Well, I'm so glad you asked. That's exactly what we're going to talk about today. And by we, I mean I. So there is a significant disparity in the diagnosis of autism and ADHD in men who get diagnosed more often and boys versus women and girls. And you may be wondering why that is. And obviously that's going to contribute to later life diagnosis as well, which we see in a lot of women. Well, that comes down to a lot of different things, and that's what I'll talk about. So I'll talk about male and female presentations versus internalizing and externalizing presentations. I'll talk about what each of those can look like, internalizing and externalizing, and then I'll talk about how that may contribute to that diagnosis difference between men and women, and also how that contributes to later life diagnosis, which we see in the research in women. So I guess I'll start with a bit of chat about, we often hear the language male and female presentations of ADHD. And while there are differences between how it presents with men and women, broadly, I would argue that when we say male and female presentations, we actually mean internalizing and externalizing presentations. And what that means is if I have an impulse to do something, or it's natural for my brain to want to work in a particular way, but society expects something different. And internalizing presentation is I will suppress that and try to fit into social norms, for example. And externalizing presentation is the naughty little boy in a classroom throwing a chair. You know, it's the I have an impulse, I act on it. Or my mind wanders and I don't force myself to come back on task, probably what I was like as a child. So male and female, there are differences. But arguably, when we talk about male and female presentations, we're really talking about internalizing and externalizing presentations. Why would I make that link, I hear you ask? Well, it's because we still live in a world where culturally we raise our sons and our daughters differently. And we don't even consider our non-binary babes. But we still hear language like boys will be boys, which is really sanctioning externalizing behavior. And we still hear language like, oh, young ladies don't act like that, which is really not sanctioning externalizing in that group. So if I raise you to believe that it's okay to act out or not, that's going to impact on whether or not you internalize your expression of neurodivergence or externalize it. And when culturally we allow it in one gender group and not others, then we're culturally contributing to that. Now, when we construct diagnostic criteria, we normally have someone in the world has difficulty, and then enough people have difficulty for it to come to the attention of clinicians and researchers. And so a bit of research gets done on that group once it's named. And then we construct what are the characteristics that most of these people have that are not attributable to something else. So, you know, if I've got low energy, that could be depression, or it could be chronic fatigue, could be autistic burnout. We need to be able to distinguish between the two. So once we've identified those things, then we have diagnostic criteria. And once the Academy agree, that gets locked into doctrine like the DSM or the ICD or the other diagnostic nosologies or the diagnostic Bibles. So once they're locked in there, though, it's kind of slow moving to change them. And if one group of humans externalizes more, they're more observable in their characteristics. Whereas if another group internalizes, if they suppress the expression of their neurodivergent characteristics, they're less likely to come to the attention of the people who are constructing diagnostic criteria. And so internalizing presentations are less likely to be built into our diagnostic processes and criteria. How does that impact our central conversation? If women internalize more, and men externalize more, then we start to argue that an internalizing presentation is a female presentation, externalizing is a male presentation, and the externalizing presentations are the ones that get locked into the diagnostic criteria, and the internalizing presentations aren't, and you're not going to get picked up for diagnosis. Often, you're not going to get noticed for having difficulties. Now, my distinction with internalizing female, externalizing male, I'm the perfect example of that. I'm not somebody who yells and screams or when I'm excited or when I'm angry. I'm somebody who's very, very flat, low key. And I'm not somebody who, if I'm angry or frustrated, kicks things, I'm somebody who will internalize that and deal with the internal stress. How does that play out? Normally it plays out with greater levels of anxiety, greater levels of depression, stepping down that path, often suicidality, self-harm. It's a little bit more commonly seen in internalizing presentations than externalizing. But, I talk about personality quite a lot. Internalizing presentations are much more likely to meet the diagnostic criteria of borderline personality disorder, for example, than are externalizing presentations. When we look at internalizing female, externalizing males, there are a couple of characteristics that we often see. And let me have a look at my notes. So internalizers, we're more likely to be diagnosed with personality disorders, more likely to have anxiety, depression, self-esteem and self-concept difficulties. Whereas that more externalizing presentation, it's more likely to see actual conduct disorders, defiant behaviors, and aggression. So how does this affect us day to day? Well, I think, I've touched on it already. As a young person, if I'd come to me for an assessment and I wasn't working in the space, I would probably have diagnosed me with generalized anxiety disorder. And there are many in our communities that do have GAD or panic disorder. Pardon me. I have the privilege of never having experienced depression, but that's really a common experience for internalizing people as well. Not to say that externalizers don't have these difficulties as well, just much more commonly seen in internalizers. However, if I'm an externalizer and neurodivergent and undiagnosed, I'm more likely to see, the stereotypes of perhaps little children melting down, perhaps adults getting into fights when we're really impulsive. Substance and alcohol misuse arguably can go either way because in each case we're trying to manage stress and distress and or impulsivity comes into play. But, you can see that there is a significant difference between internalizing and externalizing presentations. So if my internalizing presentation isn't stored in the diagnostic criteria and internalizers or women and girls and some biological males are more likely to be internalizers, then we're not going to get picked up. We're not going to be the child in the classroom who the teachers notice and send us off or talk to our parents and we get sent off for an ADHD diagnosis. And because we really, in the Western world at least, we teach our daughters to be pro-social much more than we teach our sons that. We teach them that, should be a good hostess, that lovely 1950s idea for those of you in very Anglo countries. Should be a good social hostess, should be able to be responsive to the people around us, should be pro-social and nurturing and caring. So the rules for young women have historically been pay attention to the social rules. So if you're autistic, you're going to inherently learn to mask more. You're going to have more stress. You're going to know what the social rules are because you probably have an internal compendium that you refer back to each time, probably with a script for each of those things. Not everyone's experience, but just a possible. Whereas if we don't expect that of our little boys, they're going to not have those things externalize more. But if I'm internalizing and I have my scripts and I have my masks, then I don't get picked up in the classroom or in the workplace or in life more broadly. But I do have a lot more stress. If I'm not getting picked up, I'm not getting diagnosed and supported and just understanding myself. I touched before on self-esteem and I'm starting to really view our difficulties through the lens of self-concept more broadly. If I don't know what I am because it's not commonly known through the diagnostic criteria, I think I'm the odd one out and I think I'm doing something wrong. I think I'm not enough. or when I'm a lot and I'm a lot, I think I'm too much. And so my self-esteem goes down, my understanding of myself, my broader self-concept becomes more corrupted from who and what I truly am. But when we know who and what I truly am, I start to see myself reflected in the people around me. I start to gravitate towards community. I know I bang on about it a lot. And in that, I see the good, the bad, and the ugly. I see the beautiful strengths that so many of us have. I see the really, really beautiful weakness that so many of us have. And I see the characteristics we have that just have no bearing on our context when we're living our lives, that are different from the average person. And when I can see that, I know that I'm not a bad person for being different. I just know that I'm different from the average person, but I have a group of people that are like me too, so I'm included. Again, with the masculine characteristics or the externalizing characteristics, much more likely to be seen, much more likely to be diagnosed, much more likely to have a little bit more of self-understanding, although a biased, deficit-based self-understanding, I would argue, up until recently. But still, there's that reduction in stress because I know who I am. I have this label to give to myself, understand myself through, and seek supports. So how does that link through to late diagnosis? Well, I think I've kind of explained it, but I may not have, so let me go again. If I'm not seen, I'm not picked up. And so it's often not until later in life when the demands on me and the demands on my capacity to mask become higher and higher, and I can no longer cope. They hit a threshold, and I can't suppress all of those characteristics that I've been trying to fit the typical mold. And suddenly I come to attention, or suddenly my mask is too heavy and I burn out, or some other thing happens. And here's where I think we often see one of the really big expressions of the female expression of neurodivergence, particularly ADHD, and that is perimenopause and menopause. Some of the research I was looking at talks about how around perimenopause, estrogen production changes. With a reduction in estrogen in a woman's body, there is a impact on some neurotransmitters, GABA, serotonin, and you'll know this old friend, dopamine. And with those changes come a lot of differences that are amplified. Things like brain fog, inattention, difficulty concentrating, sensory gating, which is argued to be that capacity to hear 5 things and block 4 of them out. So arguably related to attention, I would think, but that's not research backed. That's my perspective or my best guess. So we start to see that come on in a lot of neurodivergent women at perimenopause and menopause, because up until that point, I talk about them as powerhouses because they are. A lot of I hate the language high functioning because it minimizes the difficulties that go into it, but everyone will know what I mean by that. Those high functioning women who have run a family, who have gone to work to put the money in the bank to feed the children and pay the rent. And then suddenly 40-something hits and there's a real struggle to keep up. And we can see a lot of those internalizing difficulties. But then, I might have touched on this last week, I think. Then not only do we see our mask of our differences, then in a lot of people approaching burnout, we see people trying to mask burnout as well. So that double mask can contribute to me burning out even more, but can also contribute to even later life diagnosis. So we can see how if I'm taught by the world around me to internalize, I'm much more likely not to have my experience of neurodivergence encoded in the diagnostic criteria. And so I'm less likely to be diagnosed and receive the supports and self-understanding that come with that early in life. So I'm more likely to have more stress, more anxiety, potentially more depression and safety-related issues, potentially personality disorder, missed diagnoses, and then potentially burnout and later life diagnosis, where if I'm an externalizer, I'm more likely to come to attention early and receive some supports and at least see myself reflected back in my peers with that same label attached, with that same label attached. I would like to pretend I speak English as a first language. Well, it's just a short episode this week, but I think that's about all I need to explain there. Hopefully that all made sense, everybody, and please do give us some feedback if you'd like to give us some feedback. And I would just like to say thanks to everyone for your patience and tolerance. I've had a lot going on in the past few months, and so I've had a big gap between episode 29 and episode 30, and just powering out to try and get this one out on time. So thank you for your tolerance, thank you for your patience, thank you for your feedback, and I'll chat to you next week. We are different, not defective. See ya.
Potty 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 podcast. Potty 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 podcast. That was so much fun.